I spent 62 years of my life terrified of being alone. 62 years building walls around myself, filling every silent second with noise, with people, with anything to keep me from looking inward. You know that fear? That tightness in your chest when you think about being alone with your own thoughts? When the quiet of an empty house seems to scream louder than any conversation. I know it well. That fear ruled me for so long I didn't even know who I was without it anymore. I ran from it my whole life. Got married too young, had kids I loved but also hid behind, worked jobs I hated just to avoid going home and facing the void. I packed my life with commitments, with people, with obligations. Anything but being alone. I'm 80 years old now, and I need to tell you something that changed everything. Something that took me a lifetime to understand, and that could save you decades of suffering if you pay attention. I was 74 when my wife died. Helena. We were together for 51 years. 51 years sharing the same house, the same bed, the same meals. She was my constant companion, my refuge, my excuse not to face myself. When she was gone, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Suddenly, the house that had always been filled with conversation, with laughter, even with arguments, became a tomb of silence. And I panicked, a panic that consumed me from the inside out, that made me wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, cold sweat dripping, that tightness in my chest, feeling like I was going to die too. I called my kids. Robert came to stay with me for 3 months. My daughter Laura came every weekend. They were thoughtful, loving, but I saw that worry in their eyes, that fear of leaving me alone, and I hated it. I hated depending on them like that. I hated that they saw the pathetic old man I'd become. You need to understand something. My whole life, I built my identity on being needed by other people. I was the provider, the husband, the father, the reliable friend. But when Helena died, half of that identity died with her. And what was left was a 74-year-old man who had no idea who he was when nobody was looking. After 6 months, my kids started suggesting I move in with one of them or hire someone to stay with me. A caregiver, someone to keep me company, and I almost agreed, almost. But something inside me, a small voice I hadn't heard in decades, said no. It said I needed to face this. Face the loneliness I'd spent my entire life avoiding. So I did something I'd never done before. I sent everyone away. Told my kids I needed time alone. They were worried, of course, but they respected it. And that's where the hardest, most liberating part of my life began. And you know what happened? For the first few days, I nearly went crazy. The silence was deafening. I'd walk around the house talking to myself just to hear a voice. I'd turn on the TV, the radio, anything to fill the void. At night, lying in bed, the fear consumed me. I'd stare at the ceiling, feeling the weight of loneliness crushing me. And in those moments, I'd think, this is it. This is how I'll die. Alone, scared, miserable. But you know what hurts the most? Realizing I'd spent my whole life afraid of something I didn't even really understand. I was afraid of loneliness, but I'd never actually experienced it. I always ran before it could catch me. And now, for the first time at 74, I was face to face with my biggest phobia. There was one specific night I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday, 2 months after Helena's death. I was sitting in the living room on the same couch where we'd watched TV together for decades, and the panic hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. My chest hurt. My hands were shaking. I was having a panic attack. I called Robert, crying like a child. And you know what he said? He said, "Dad, you need to learn to be alone. You can't run from this forever." And I hated him in that moment. I hated him because he was right, because I knew he was right, and because I didn't have the courage to admit it. Tell me here in the comments, are you also afraid of being alone? You can just write, "I'm afraid of being alone because," and finish it. You don't need a lot of detail if you don't want to. But you know why this matters? Because when we put these fears into words, they lose some of their power over us. And your comment might make someone else feel less alone in this fear too. So tell me, what are you afraid of when you think about loneliness? After 3 weeks of pure panic, something started to change. I began to notice things, small things, the sound of the birds in the morning, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, the taste of the coffee I made the way I liked it, not the way Helena always insisted was better. I started walking alone in the park every morning. At first, I wore headphones, loud music to drown out my thoughts. But gradually, I took them off, and I started to listen, to really listen. The wind in the trees, the laughter of children playing, my own footsteps on the pavement. And for the first time in decades, I started to hear my own thoughts without being afraid of them. You see, what nobody tells you about loneliness is that there's a huge difference between being alone and feeling lonely. I spent my whole life surrounded by people, but feeling deeply lonely because I'd never stopped to get to know the one person who would be with me from beginning to end, myself. I had built my entire identity around other people. I was Helena's husband, Robert and Laura's father, an employee at the company where I worked for 38 years, a friend of Joe, of Carlos, of Renato. But who was I when I took all those labels off? I had no idea, and that terrified me. Helena gave me an old journal for our 25th wedding anniversary. She'd written on the first page, "For your thoughts." I never wrote a single word in it, not once, because I didn't have any thoughts of my own, only echoes of other people's. But one afternoon, 3 months after she passed, I picked up that journal and started writing. Without much thought, I just let the words spill out. And you know what came out? Anger. So much anger. Anger that I'd spent 51 years in a marriage where I was never truly myself. Anger that I'd worked a job I hated. Anger that I'd neglected my dreams. Anger at myself for letting fear control me for so long. And I cried. I cried like I'd never cried before. I cried for the life I didn't live, for the choices I didn't make, for the words I didn't say. I cried until I had no tears left. And when I stopped, something strange happened. I felt lighter, as if those tears had washed away something heavy I'd been carrying for decades without realizing it. I started doing things I'd never done. Cooking, not for anyone, just for myself. Trying out recipes, messing up, getting it right, it didn't matter. I learned to make a risotto that was better than any restaurant's. I started reading again. Books I'd always wanted to read, but never had the time. I'd sit on the porch with a coffee and get lost in stories for hours. I read Dostoevsky. I read Machado de Assis. I read books on philosophy, on spirituality, on human nature, and each book taught me something new about myself. I started writing too. Nothing of great importance, just thoughts, memories, things I'd never stopped to process. I wrote about my childhood, about my dad, who died when I was 23, and with whom I never had a real conversation. About my mom, who lived to be 86, but whom I visited more out of obligation than desire. About my regrets. And there were so many that sometimes I wondered how one person could accumulate so much regret in a single lifetime. One day, about 6 months after Helena's death, I was sitting in the living room reading, and I realized something. I was at peace. A deep, genuine peace I hadn't felt since I was a child. It wasn't exactly happiness. It was something more solid than that. It was contentment. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. For the first time in my life, I felt complete without needing anyone to validate me. And that was both liberating and terrifying. Because if I didn't need anyone, then all those decades I clung to people that I built my entire life around not being alone were a waste. But I'll tell you something important. This peace didn't come easy. It wasn't a linear process. There were days when I completely regressed, days when the panic would come back with a vengeance and I'd call my kids in a panic, days when I'd go to bed at 7 in the evening just to avoid facing a few more hours of silence, days when I seriously considered hiring that caregiver just to have another human presence in the house. But every time I resisted, every time I faced the fear instead of running from it, I got a little stronger. I have a friend, Carlos, who also became a widower around the same time I did. Carlos did the opposite. He remarried in less than a year, a nice woman, Mariana, 15 years younger than him, who takes care of him, keeps him company. He seems happy in the photos he posts on Facebook. But I see him sometimes when no one's looking, and I see that same panic in his eyes that I used to have, that desperate fear of being alone. He hasn't found peace. He's just found another distraction. And I don't judge him. Until a year ago, I would have done exactly the same thing. There was another friend of mine, Renato, who died alone in his apartment. No one noticed for 4 days. 4 days. When they found his body, the TV was still on. He was 79 years old. No family, no close friends. And you know what my first reaction was when I heard? Fear. Pure fear that would be my fate too. But now I understand. Renato didn't die because he was alone. Renato died alone because he spent his whole life isolated from people, because he never cultivated genuine connections. And there's a massive difference between choosing to be alone and being forced to be alone because you pushed everyone away. But here's the brutal truth nobody wants to hear. You will die alone. No matter how many people you have around you, in the end, you will make that journey alone. And if you spend your entire life running from loneliness, when it finally catches up to you, and it will catch up, you won't know how to handle it. It will be terrifying. But you know what I learned? When you stop running, when you turn and face loneliness head on, it loses its power over you. And you discover that what you thought was your greatest fear was actually the key to your freedom. Today, at 80, I can tell you with all sincerity that the last 6 years of my life have been the happiest. Not because something extraordinary happened, not because I won the lottery or discovered some magic secret, but because I finally stopped running. I stopped filling every second of silence with noise. I learned to sit in the silence and let it teach me. And it taught me a lot. It taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can handle pain, loss, uncertainty. It taught me that I don't need external validation to have value, that my own company can be enough. It taught me that loving yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. It's the foundation of everything. Because how can you genuinely love another person if you can't even be alone with yourself for 5 minutes? Have you ever stopped to think about that? When was the last time you spent an entire day alone? No TV, no phone, no music, no distractions. Just you and your thoughts. Most people have never done that, and they're afraid just thinking about doing it, because we were taught that loneliness is bad, that being alone means there's something wrong with you, that you failed in some way. But that's a lie. Loneliness is neutral. It's what you do with it that determines whether it will destroy you or transform you. I've got a routine now. I wake up early, make my coffee, sit on the porch, and stay there for an hour, just observing, watching the day break, watching the neighbors head out to work, kids off to school, life happening all around me while I'm there at peace, just being. Then I walk 5 miles every day, alone with my thoughts. And you know what I've discovered? My thoughts aren't my enemies. They're my companions. They're voices of experience, of memories, of lessons learned. And when I stop to listen, they guide me. In the afternoon, I read, or I write, or I just sit and think. I think about my life, about the choices I've made, about the people I've loved, about the mistakes I've made, and instead of running from these thoughts like I used to, I embrace them, I examine them, I learn from them. And little by little, I'm healing from wounds I didn't even know I had. Wounds of rejection from childhood. Wounds from harsh words I heard from my dad. Wounds from missed opportunities that still sting when I remember them. My kids come to visit regularly, and now, when they arrive, I greet them with a presence I never had before, because I don't need them to feel whole anymore. I'm already whole, so I can love them freely without that desperate need I used to have. And they notice. Robert told me the other day I seem lighter, happier, that he enjoys spending time with me now in a way he never did before, and that hurts. It hurts because I realize I wasted so many years being physically present but emotionally absent as a father, because I was so busy running from myself that I couldn't be present for them. Laura brought my granddaughter, Sophie, to spend a weekend with me a few weeks ago. Sophie's 8, and you know what she told me? She said, "Grandpa, you're fun now. Before, you were kind of boring." And I laughed. I laughed because she was right. I was boring, stressed, always worried, always running from something invisible. But now I can sit on the floor and play with her. I can listen to her stories without my mind wandering. I can truly be present. And that's a gift I never thought I'd be able to give. But I'll tell you something that might shock you. I miss Helena every single day. The pain of loss hasn't gone away. It probably never will. But it doesn't paralyze me anymore, because I've learned that I can carry the grief and still live. I can miss her and still be at peace. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Life is paradoxical like that. You can be sad and grateful at the same time, alone and complete, slowly dying and more alive than ever. There are times when I pick up a photo of Helena and talk to her. I tell her about my day, what I cooked, what book I'm reading, and sometimes I apologize. Apologize for not being the husband she deserved, for spending 51 years by her side, but never truly letting her know me, because I didn't know myself. How could I let someone know me if I didn't even know who I was? If I could go back in time and talk to my 40-year-old self, I'd say stop. Stop running. Stop filling every second with noise and distraction. Sit in silence. Get to know yourself. Learn to be alone without feeling lonely. Because the most important person you'll spend your entire life with is yourself. And if you can't even stand your own company, how do you expect others to? I'd say stop building your identity around other people. You aren't just a husband, wife, father, mother, son, daughter, employee. You are you, and when all those other people are gone, and they will eventually be, you need something solid to stand on, and that something is you. Not your achievements, not your social status, not how many people love you, but who you are when you strip away all those layers. Start spending time alone intentionally, not because you have no one, but because you choose to. Turn off your phone. Go for a walk with no destination. Sit in a coffee shop and just observe. Write down your thoughts. Read books that challenge you. Learn something new. Not to impress anyone, but because you want to grow, because you want to become a more interesting person to yourself. Start cultivating hobbies you can do alone. Not because you're antisocial, but because you need things that are yours, that no one can take away, that don't depend on the presence of others, because in the end, all you really have is yourself. I started painting. At 75, I bought paints and canvases and started painting. I'm not good. My paintings look like a child's work. But it doesn't matter, because when I paint, I lose track of time. I enter a flow state where there's no past or future, just the present, just me, the canvas, and the colors. And listen, this is the most important part. Listen to your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own body. Learn the difference between being alone and feeling lonely. Learn to enjoy your own company, because if you don't like being with yourself, how do you expect others to? I spent decades hating my own company, thinking I was boring, uninteresting, worthless. And you know why? Because I'd never stopped to truly know myself. I'd accepted the version of myself that other people had created, the version my parents wanted, the version society expected, but it wasn't me. You know what's ironic? Now that I've learned to be alone, people want to be with me more than ever. My kids call more often. Neighbors stop to chat. I've made new friends at the park where I walk. There's a gentleman, Mr. Antonio, who's 77 and walks at the same time I do. We meet every day, sometimes walk together, grab coffee afterward, and our conversations are deep, real. It's not superficial talk about the weather or the news. We talk about life, about our fears, our regrets, our dreams we still have. Because when you're at peace with yourself, when you don't desperately need other people, you become magnetic. People feel it. They sense that you're not going to drain them, that you have something solid inside. But the best part isn't that. The best part is that now, when I'm with other people, I'm truly present. I'm not running from loneliness. I'm not using them as a distraction. I'm there because I choose to be, because I want to be. And that makes all the difference. The conversations are deeper, the connections more genuine, because there's no desperation behind it, just choice, just presence, just genuine love without need. There are nights I sit in this living room, the same one where I had a full-blown panic attack when Helena died, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude for having had to face my biggest fear, because it gave me the greatest gift I could ever receive. It gave me myself back. It gave me freedom. It gave me peace. And it gave me time, real time. Not time filled with noise and distraction, but quality time with myself. Time to process 80 years of life. Time to forgive. Time to heal. Time to finally live. How old are you now? 30? 40? 50? 60? It doesn't matter. You still have time. Time to stop running. Time to turn around and face what scares you. Time to learn to be alone without feeling lonely. And I promise you, when you do this, when you really do this, you'll discover a freedom you never knew existed. A peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. A completeness that no one can take away from you. Because here's the thing, loneliness isn't the problem. The problem is the fear of loneliness. The problem is thinking you need other people to feel whole. You don't. You're already whole. You always were. You just forgot. You just convinced yourself otherwise because everyone around you believes that lie too. Because we live in a society that teaches us being alone is failure. That if you don't have friends, a partner, family always by your side, there's something wrong with you. But that's a lie. The truth is, the most important person you need to learn to love, to know, to respect is yourself. But I'm here telling you, as someone who's spent 80 years on this planet, who's lived a lot, loved a lot, lost a lot, the most important thing you can do for yourself is learn to be alone. Because in the end, that's all you have. And if that scares you now, imagine how it will feel when you're 70, 80, and have never faced that fear. Will it be too late? No, it's never too late. I'm proof of that. But why wait? Why waste another decade running from something that will eventually catch up to you anyway? There's a quote I read every day. It's taped to the fridge. I wrote it myself after a particularly deep journaling session. The quote is, "Loneliness is only painful when you're running from yourself. When you finally stop and find yourself, it transforms into freedom." And it's true. It's the deepest truth I've ever discovered. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe you're also afraid of being alone. Maybe you also fill every second with noise, so you don't have to face the silence. You're not alone in that fear. But you need to know that this fear is holding you back from living fully. This channel exists for people like you. People who are willing to face hard truths to live a more authentic life. Subscribe here to get more real stories, more lessons that took decades to learn, more wisdom from someone who's walked where you're walking now. Hit that like button if this video made you reflect on your relationship with solitude, if it made you question the fears you carry. And please tell me in the comments, what would you do if you weren't afraid of being alone? What dream would you chase? What change would you make in your life? I'd love to know, because maybe, just maybe, by sharing it, you'll take the first step towards claiming that freedom. Time is ticking. Every day you run from the silence is a day less you have to find yourself. Don't wait until you're 80 like me to discover the person you were searching for your whole life was inside you all along.